The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gates as Captain James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red uniform for what felt like the 1,000th time. For 12 years, he had stood at these very gates, watching the world go by through the iron bars that separated the royal grounds from the bustling streets of London. His polished black boots reflected the early light, and his tall black hat sat perfectly straight on his head. James was known among his fellow guards as the statue. He never moved during his shifts, never broke protocol, and never acknowledged the tourists who snapped countless photos of him. The Queen's Guard had a reputation to maintain, and James took that responsibility seriously. His colleagues often joked that he was carved from marble, not flesh and blood. The tourists began arriving early that Tuesday morning. School children pressed their faces against the gates, trying to make him smile or blink. Street performers set up nearby, hoping to catch some of the attention meant for the guards. The usual crowd of onlookers gathered, cameras ready, waiting for the changing of the guard ceremony that wouldn't happen for another 3 hours. James focused on a spot just above the crowd's heads, his expression stern and unchanging. This was his duty, his calling. He had served in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and discipline was second nature to him. His wife Sarah often told their friends that James was the most reliable man she'd ever known. "If James says he'll do something, consider it done," she would say with pride. But something felt different about this particular morning. The air was crisp with autumn's arrival, and there was an unusual energy in the crowd. More people than usual had gathered, and they seemed more restless, more talkative. James maintained his position, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Among the crowd, street vendors called out their wares, a coffee cart positioned in itself strategically near the bus stop, its owner knowing that tourists would need their morning caffeine fix. The aroma of fresh pastries drifted from a nearby bakery, mixing with the exhaust fumes from the London buses that regularly stopped to discharge their cargo of excited visitors. James had seen it all before. The same patterns, the same routines, the same type of people day after day. Families on vacation, amateur photographers trying to capture the perfect shot, history enthusiasts explaining the significance of the guards to anyone who would listen. It was predictable, comfortable, and exactly how James liked his world to be ordered. His radio crackled softly with routine communications between the guards, weather reports, visitor counts, and the occasional update about VIP arrivals. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would require him to break from his post or abandon the rigid protocol that had governed his life for over a decade. As the morning progressed, the crowd continued to grow. James noticed the mix was typical. Tourists with their guidebooks and cameras, local office workers grabbing coffee on their way to work, and the regular homeless individuals who often sought shelter in the area. Everyone kept their distance from the gates, understanding the invisible boundary that separated them from the royal grounds. The pigeons that had made the palace area their home strutted boldly between the feet of visitors, looking for dropped crumbs or handouts. James had grown accustomed to their presence over the years. They were part of the daily landscape, as predictable as the sunrise and just as reliable in their routines. But routines, James would soon discover, were meant to be broken. Around 10:30 in the morning, James noticed a disturbance in the crowd's usual rhythm. People were turning to look toward the bus stop, their conversations growing quieter. Some were pointing, others were whispering among themselves. His training kicked in immediately. Any unusual activity could signal a potential security threat. Through his peripheral vision, James spotted an elderly woman near the bus stop. She appeared to be in distress, leaning heavily against the metal post that held the bus schedule. Her gray hair was disheveled, and she clutched a worn brown handbag against her chest. She looked to be in her 70s, wearing a faded blue coat that had seen better days. The woman swayed slightly, and James could see that something was wrong. She pressed one hand to her forehead while gripping the bus stop post with the other. Her face had gone pale, and she seemed to be struggling to stay upright. The morning commuters and tourists around her continued their activities, most not noticing her distress or choosing to ignore it. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. His duty was clear: remain at his post, maintain protocol, and never abandon his position during active duty. The Queen's Guard manual was explicit about this. Under no circumstances should a guard leave their assigned position unless ordered to do so by a superior officer or in case of immediate threat to royal security. But as he watched, the elderly woman's condition seemed to worsen. She slumped further against the post, and her handbag slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Coins scattered across the sidewalk, mixing with fallen autumn leaves. A few photographs fluttered in the morning breeze. Personal items that clearly meant something to her were now scattered at the feet of passing strangers. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people glanced at the woman but continued walking, perhaps assuming someone else would help. Others stopped, but seemed unsure of what to do. A few tourists took out their phones, but instead of calling for help, they appeared to be taking pictures of what they saw as another interesting London street scene. James's military training in Afghanistan came flooding back. He had seen people in distress before, and he knew the signs of someone who needed immediate assistance. The woman's pallor, her unsteady movement, and her apparent confusion all pointed to a medical emergency. She could be having a heart attack, a stroke, or suffering from diabetic shock. His radio remained silent. No orders came through about the situation. His fellow guards at the other gates were too far away to see what was happening. The responsibility, if he chose to take it, would be his alone. James felt sweat forming under his heavy ceremonial uniform despite the cool morning air. The woman tried to bend down to collect her scattered belongings, but she nearly lost her balance in the process. A kind passerby steadied her arm, but then continued on their way, leaving her still struggling and clearly disoriented. James watched as she looked around desperately, as if searching for someone she recognized or somewhere safe to go. Time seemed to slow down as James wrestled with the decision that would change everything. Every fiber of his training told him to stay put, to maintain discipline, to trust that someone else would handle the situation. But his conscience, shaped by years of military service and a deep sense of duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, was screaming at him to act. The crowd had grown larger, with more people stopping to watch both the distressed woman and the stoic guard who stood motionless at his post. Some visitors had noticed James's internal struggle, pointing out to their companions how the guard's jaw had tightened and his hands had formed slight fists at his sides. In that moment, James Mitchell faced the biggest decision of his 12-year career as a Queen's Guard. The moment of decision arrived when the elderly woman suddenly stumbled and nearly fell to the ground. A young tourist managed to catch her arm, preventing a complete collapse, but it was clear she needed immediate medical attention. Her lips had turned slightly blue and she was breathing heavily, each breath appearing to require tremendous effort. James looked at the woman, then at his post, then back at the woman. In his mind, he could hear his commanding officer's voice during training. The Queen's Guard never abandons their position, never, but he could also hear his father's voice from childhood. Son, when someone needs help, you help them. That's what makes us human. Without thinking any further, James took his first step away from the palace gates in 12 years of service. The tourist nearest to him gasped audibly. Cameras immediately swung in his direction. Someone shouted, "Look, the guard is moving." The ripple effect spread through the crowd like wildfire. James walked with purpose toward the bus stop, his ceremonial sword gently bouncing at his side with each step. His polished boots clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet street. Every eye was on him as he approached the elderly woman, who was now sitting on the ground, supported by two concerned bystanders. "Ma'am, I'm James. I'm here to help you," he said gently, kneeling down beside her in his full ceremonial uniform. His voice was calm and reassuring, trained through years of military service to project confidence in crisis situations. The woman looked up at him with confusion and gratitude, her eyes struggling to focus. I don't feel well," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the growing crowd. "I was waiting for the bus to visit my grandson, but everything started spinning." Her accent revealed she was a local London resident, not a tourist. This was her neighborhood, her daily routine that had suddenly gone terribly wrong. James quickly assessed her condition. Her pulse was weak, but steady when he checked her wrist. Her skin was clammy and cold to the touch. "Has anyone called an ambulance?" he asked the bystanders. A young man held up his phone, nodding. "They're on their way. Should be here in 5 minutes," he replied. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching in amazement, as the famously stoic Queen's Guard provided medical assistance to a stranger. Phones were recording from every angle, capturing a moment that would soon spread across social media around the world. But James was focused entirely on the woman in front of him. "What's your name?" James asked, taking off his ceremonial gloves to better check her pulse and temperature. The woman's eyes seemed to clear slightly at the sound of his gentle voice. "Margaret," she replied, managing a weak smile. "Margaret Thompson. I'm 78 years old and I've lived in London my entire life. I've walked past you guards thousands of times, but I never thought—" Her voice trailed off as another wave of dizziness hit her. "Well, Margaret Thompson, today's your lucky day because you've got your own personal Queen's Guard looking after you," James said with a warmth that surprised even himself. He hadn't broken character like this in over a decade, but something about Margaret's vulnerability brought out his natural compassion. James removed his heavy ceremonial hat and placed it on the ground beside him, revealing his close-cropped, brown hair. The crowd gasped again at this unprecedented break in protocol. He then took off his red ceremonial jacket and gently placed it over Margaret's shoulders to keep her warm while they waited for the ambulance. "My grandson is expecting me," Margaret said weakly. "I promised I'd bring him his favorite biscuits for his birthday. They're in my bag." She looked around at her scattered belongings with obvious distress. Without hesitation, James began collecting Margaret's items from the pavement. He carefully picked up the photographs that had scattered, gathered the coins, and restored her handbag to order. The crowd watched in respectful silence as this symbol of royal authority knelt on the London sidewalk, performing the simple act of helping a neighbor in need. As sirens could be heard in the distance, James held Margaret's hand and kept talking to her, keeping her conscious and alert until professional medical help could arrive. The ambulance arrived with its blue lights flashing, and the paramedics quickly took over Margaret's care. As they checked her vital signs and prepared her for transport to the hospital, James remained by her side, still holding her hand. "What are we?" Lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, looked at James with obvious respect. "You did exactly the right thing," she told him quietly. "She's having a diabetic episode, and your quick response probably saved her from going into shock. She's going to be fine thanks to you." The paramedic's words carried the weight of professional judgment, confirming that James's decision to abandon his post had been medically necessary. Margaret squeezed James's hand weakly as the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're an angel in a red coat." Her eyes were clearer now, the color returning to her cheeks as the paramedics administered glucose and stabilized her condition. James smiled genuinely for the first time in years while on duty. "Just doing what anyone would do, Mrs. Thompson." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Many people had walked past Margaret that morning without stopping to help. His decision to break protocol and abandon his post had been extraordinary, not ordinary. As the ambulance doors closed and drove away with Margaret safely inside, James suddenly became aware of his surroundings again. He was standing in the middle of a London street in his white undershirt, having given his ceremonial jacket to Margaret. His famous red coat was now on its way to the hospital, wrapped around a grateful elderly woman. The crowd that had gathered was now massive, easily over 100 people. They had formed a respectful circle around where James stood, and their faces showed a mixture of admiration, surprise, and joy. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of what they had all witnessed. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. It started slowly, just one person's hands coming together in appreciation, but within seconds, the applause spread through the entire crowd like a wave. People were not just clapping, they were cheering, whistling, and calling out words of praise. "Well done, mate," shouted a businessman in a suit. "That's what real heroism looks like," called out a mother holding her young child. You're a credit to the uniform, yelled an elderly man who looked to be about Margaret's age. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic with each passing moment. James stood in the center of this incredible outpouring of public appreciation, feeling overwhelmed by the response. He had expected to face disciplinary action for abandoning his post. Instead, he found himself surrounded by strangers who were celebrating his decision to put human compassion ahead of rigid protocol. Children in the crowd were pointing at him with wide eyes, clearly impressed by what they had witnessed. There, parents were explaining what had happened, turning this into a teachable moment about kindness and doing the right thing. Several people were still recording with their phones, capturing the aftermath of this unprecedented moment. James realized he needed to return to his duties, but he also needed to retrieve his ceremonial jacket from the hospital later and file a report about abandoning his post. As he began to walk back toward the palace gates, the crowd parted to create a path for him, still applauding and cheering. But James knew the real test was still to come. His commanding officer would need to be informed about what had happened, and there would certainly be an investigation into his breach of protocol. The Queen's Guard had rules for a reason, and those rules had been in place for centuries. What he had done was unprecedented, and the consequences were far from certain. As he approached the palace gates, James saw his fellow guard, Corporal Davies, watching him with a mixture of concern and admiration. Davies had witnessed the entire incident from his position at the adjacent gate, but had been too far away to assist. Now he would need to help James face whatever consequences awaited them both. Within 30 minutes of James returning to his post, word of the incident had reached the highest levels of the palace administration. Major Harrison, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, arrived at the gates with a stern expression that James knew all too well. The crowd, which had mostly dispersed but still lingered in smaller groups, watched with renewed interest as the military drama unfolded. "Captain Mitchell, you will accompany me immediately," Major Harrison said in his clipped, authoritative tone. James followed him through the palace gates and into the administrative offices, leaving Corporal Davies to cover his position. As they walked, James prepared himself for what could be a career-ending conversation. In the oak-paneled office that had seen decades of military discipline and tradition, Major Harrison sat behind his imposing desk and gestured for James to remain standing. The walls were lined with portraits of former commanding officers, their painted eyes seeming to judge James's unprecedented breach of protocol. "Captain Mitchell, in 12 years of service, you have been exemplary. Your record is spotless, your dedication unquestionable," Major Harrison began, his voice measured and serious, "which makes today's events all the more difficult to understand. You abandoned your post. You broke protocol that has been maintained for centuries. You gave away part of your uniform to a civilian." James stood at attention, his eyes focused, straight ahead. "Yes, sir, I take full responsibility for my actions." He didn't attempt to justify or explain his decision. Military protocol was clear. When you broke the rules, you accepted the consequences without excuse. Major Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. The incident was recorded by dozens of people. The videos are already spreading across social media. The BBC has called asking for a statement. This is becoming a public relations situation that extends far beyond military discipline. James felt his heart sink. Not only had he potentially ended his own career, but he had created a publicity problem for the institution he had served faithfully for over a decade. The Queen's Guard was supposed to be above such controversies, a symbol of unwavering tradition and reliability. However, Major Harrison continued, and James detected a slight change in his tone. "I have also received a call from Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty has been made aware of the situation." James's breath caught in his throat. The Queen herself knew about his breach of protocol. Major Harrison reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sheet of official palace letterhead. "I have been instructed to read you this message. Captain Mitchell's actions today exemplify the finest traditions of service to others that the Crown represents. While protocol is important, compassion and human decency are the foundation upon which all protocol should rest. The Queen's Guard serves not just the monarchy, but the people of Britain. and Captain Mitchell's assistance to a citizen in need reflects honor upon the uniform and the crown. James blinked in surprise, hardly believing what he was hearing. Instead of facing discipline, he was receiving royal approval for his actions. Major Harrison set the letter down and looked at James with what might have been the hint of a smile. Furthermore, Major Harrison continued, "I have just received word from the hospital. Mrs. Margaret Thompson is in stable condition and has specifically requested to return your ceremonial jacket personally. She also wanted me to tell you that her grandson received his birthday biscuits, thanks to your kindness in helping her collect her scattered belongings." The weight of potential consequences that had been pressing down on James's shoulders suddenly lifted. He had been prepared to face discipline, possibly even dismissal from the service he loved. Instead, he found himself being commended by the highest authority in the land. Major Harrison stood up and walked around his desk to face James directly. "The Queen's Guard has always been about more than just standing at attention, Captain Mitchell. We are guardians, protectors, and servants of something greater than ourselves. Today, you reminded everyone what that really means." James felt a wave of emotion that he hadn't experienced since his military service in Afghanistan. The validation from his commanding officer and from the Crown itself meant more than any public praise or social media attention could ever provide. "There will, of course, need to be some procedural adjustments," Major Harrison continued, returning to his businesslike tone. "We cannot have guards abandoning their posts regularly, regardless of circumstances. But your actions today will become part of our training protocols as an example of when human judgment must override rigid adherence to rules." As James prepared to leave the office and return to his duties, he realized that this single moment of decision had changed not just his own life, but potentially the way the Queen's Guard would approach their service to the British people for generations to come. 3 days later, James found himself back at the palace gates, but this time as part of an extraordinary ceremony that had never occurred in the history of the Queen's Guard. Margaret Thompson, now fully recovered and wearing her best dress, arrived in a palace car to personally return James's ceremonial jacket and to meet the man who had helped save her life. The media had caught wind of the planned meeting, and a respectful crowd of journalists and well-wishers had gathered outside the palace gates. But this time, the attention felt different to James. Instead of being the silent, stoic figure that tourists photographed, he was being recognized as a human being who had made a difficult moral choice. Margaret walked slowly but steadily toward the gates, carrying James's freshly cleaned and pressed red ceremonial jacket. Her grandson, a boy of about 10 with bright, curious eyes, accompanied her, holding her arm supportively. She had insisted on this public meeting to properly thank the man who had come to her aid. "Captain Mitchell," Margaret said with a warm smile as she approached the gates, "I wanted to return this to you personally and to thank you properly for what you did." She held out the red jacket, its brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. James, dressed in his full ceremonial uniform minus the jacket, stepped forward to receive it. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm just glad you're feeling better. How are you doing?" His voice carried genuine concern, the same warmth he had shown 3 days earlier when he knelt beside her on the pavement. "I'm doing wonderfully, thanks to you," Margaret replied. "But more importantly, I wanted to introduce you to someone very special." She gestured to her grandson, who stepped forward with obvious excitement. "This is Tommy, the grandson I was going to visit when I fell ill. He's been talking about nothing else since he heard what happened. Tommy, this is Captain Mitchell, the Queen's Guard who helped grandmother." Tommy looked up at James with the kind of pure admiration that only children can express. "Are you really a hero?" he asked with complete sincerity. "My teacher says you're famous now because you helped my Nan." James knelt down to Tommy's eye level, just as he had done with Margaret 3 days earlier. "I'm not a hero, Tommy. I just did what I hoped someone would do for my own grandmother if she needed help. The real heroes are people like your Nan, who are brave enough to go out and live their lives every day." The crowd that had gathered began to applaud again, just as they had 3 days earlier. But this applause felt different too. It wasn't just appreciation for a single act of kindness. It was recognition of something larger about human nature and the connections that bind communities together. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I brought you something," she said with a mischievous smile. "The same biscuits I was bringing to Tommy for his birthday. I thought you might like to try them." James accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. In all his years of service, he had never received a personal gift from a member of the public. The simple package of homemade biscuits meant more to him than any military commendation could have. As the formal ceremony concluded and the media began to disperse, Margaret took James's hand one final time. "You know," she said quietly, "I've lived in London for 78 years and I've seen a lot of changes. But what you did reminded me that some things never change. Good people doing good things when it matters most." James returned to his position at the palace gates that afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose. The tourists still came, the cameras still clicked, and the daily routines continued much as they always had. But something fundamental had changed, both for James and for the institution he served. The story of the Queen's Guard who abandoned his post to help an elderly woman had spread around the world, becoming a symbol of humanity triumphing over bureaucracy, of compassion overriding protocol. Letters and messages of support arrived from every continent, all praising James for showing that even the most traditional institutions could adapt when human need required it. But perhaps the most significant change was in James himself. He still stood at his post with the same dedication and professionalism he had always shown. But now, when he looked out at the crowd of visitors and passers-by, he didn't see them as distractions from his duty. He saw them as the people he was truly meant to serve and protect. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the crowd was quiet, James could swear he heard the echo of that spontaneous applause that had erupted 3 days earlier, reminding him that the best traditions are not the ones that never change, but the ones that grow stronger by adapting to serve the human heart.